Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for coming along and joining us for this Sifted Talks about startup cybersecurity in partnership with cybersecurity management platform Vanta. And we don't need to look far and wide to see how much of an issue this is, even for huge companies. Just last week, British companies, the BBC, Boots, and British Airways all saw hundreds of thousands of employees' data stolen in a cyber attack. And the impact of cyber attacks at startups can be existential. 60% of small businesses go out of business within 6 months after falling victim to a data breach, which is all quite scary stuff. But we're going to be talking about how startups can avoid that fate. And joining me to discuss that is Herman Errico, the Cybersecurity Executive at Vanta, Emily Castles, the co-founder and CTO at global employee payment platform Boundless, and Miguel Pinho, CTO at VC Seedcamp. Now, we're not going to have a Q&A session at the end because we want this to be an open discussion from the very start. So submit your questions via the chat box on the right-hand side corner of your screen as soon as they pop into your head, and we'll dip into them throughout the talk. And I want to start by asking what the biggest cybersecurity threats for startups are. Let's start with the real doom stuff. Herman, you work with loads of startups on cybersecurity. What are you hearing? Like, what are the challenges that the startups you work with face on a day-to-day basis?
First, thanks for having us today. But there are various levels of threats to companies. I think that starting with probably the simplest one, I think a phishing attack is always on top of mind, especially with smaller companies that they don't have a lot of processes, we don't do a lot of training. So I think phishing is certainly something that is concerning because it can impact the company at a wider scale. And then cloud environment misconfiguration. That is probably the second biggest threat that I would consider as a early stage startup founder. But curious to hear maybe what other people think about this.
Yeah, Emily, what about you? Does that resonate? Are there different challenges at Boundless?
Yeah, for sure. I think particularly in the beginning, right, they're the kind of like simple things that you might not be set up to protect against. Like for us, like my main fears are breaches that are possibly accidental, sometimes more than malicious, right? It's not that somebody's targeting us, it's that, we just haven't set up our processes correctly. So somebody ends up putting a piece of data in front of somebody else, by mistake, and it's kind of making sure that you're kind of thinking of those things in advance and that your processes are right for that.
Yeah. And what about from the VC perspective, Miguel? What are the biggest challenges that you face?
Yeah, I think like the phishing part is definitely something that is very important, and it's important to train your team as early as you can to understand how those work. I think also with the advancements of generative AI, I think you like a few years ago, it was really easy to spot, for example, a phishing email, and you could easily train and give those hints. I think now it will be increasingly difficult. So I think that is definitely top of the line. And if you combine that with what Emily said, essentially about setting up right processes and the right settings, even internally, then that can become really dangerous, right? You can think about transferring money to the wrong place, which is what you definitely want to avoid, which we've avoided so far, but it's definitely something you see phishing attempts going really wild. So yeah, you need to be careful.
Yeah. I mean, there has been like a total change of pace in terms of like sophistication of phishing attempts, being able to sound like a person, being able to sound like a human being. That's got to make a difference. And I mean, like it definitely has over the past couple of years, even before this like wave of generative AI swept across Europe. Things were getting more difficult for startups on a cybersecurity front. Like there's loads of stats that tell us that over the past few years, the amount of cybersecurity attacks on startups have risen. What's causing this shift, do you think, Herman?
I think there are a number of moving parts here. the shift is really more companies that have started to use cloud environments, and there is a big migration to a cloud native infrastructure that brings a lot of agility, but it exposes to a lot of new threats. And I think especially at the early stage, security is probably not the biggest concern of a startup founder. So a lot of infrastructures are built without the really basic security components that you want to have within your own infrastructure. I think one of many is really your security headers in your web-facing platform. This is often overlooked, and it's used to launch web application attacks. And maybe to just mention on something that Miguel said before about there is an increase in sophistication in terms of generative AI attacks, and they sound more realistic. However, a pattern that we've seen is that attackers now are mimicking the notifications that you get from your Teams, your Slack, your DocuSign. So that is something to watch out for, because I've recently observed a big increase in those notifications that we usually take for granted. Oh, I got a notification from DocuSign, I need to sign something. Yeah, let me do it immediately. So those are the things that I think startup founders should consider.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about cloud infrastructure and the benefits it brings. Obviously, companies can be, as you say, far more agile than they were, but there are risks associated with that. And I'm going to immediately jump into the Q&A box because we've had a good one come in. And Andrew Ranson asks, if your data is secured with a cloud market leader, do you need liability insurance if their data environment was breached? Who wants to jump in on that one?
All right, I'll jump in on this one. I think first thing to consider is that within a cloud share responsibility model, you are responsible for the data that you put into the cloud environment. You're responsible for user access management. And if you have an infrastructure as a service, you're responsible for patching that infrastructure as well. So yes, you can be on GCP, and GCP may have a SOC 2 and 27001 and all the certification in the world. They provide you with strong security controls. However, if you don't configure your environment effectively and you get breached, it's on the company. So do you need cyber insurance for that? Yes, you might. However, it all depends on risk management and your liability coverage, because your insurance provider is not going to cover if you didn't do all you needed to do. So I think there is an interesting lens here. Love to hear from Miguel or Emily as well on that point.
Yeah, Miguel,
Yeah.
why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I think 100%. I think like all of these cloud providers, right? They give you the tool set and it's up to you. So if you mess it up, then it doesn't matter. Then it's up to you. And in the end, the responsibility is yours. So you need to be careful. And yeah, on the insurance part, I don't have a strong opinion or a grounded opinion, and I'm always very afraid of sharing opinions that I don't feel well grounded upon. So I'll revert to the lawyers. But yes, it's definitely one to look into. Let's put it at least that way. I think to consider having 100%, to have or not will probably depend on quite a few variables, including the industry, type of data you keep, how much data you have, all this kind of stuff, like geographies, like there's probably, and like Emily will probably know a lot about like geographies and implications of like regulation across multiple economic areas, to not say countries, because it can be different. Yeah. So
yeah, for sure. Like I kind of feel the same as you, Miguel. Like it's really hard to say yes or no to this question, and it's kind of like you're coming at it from the point of view of being a founder. Well, for me as a founder, like it relates to your risk profile and what your business is, and the risk profile that you have at certain stages of your business as well. So it's not black and white, and like I don't think any startup is going to kind of come out the gate with liability insurance, right? Like that's not going to be the first thing that you do, but it should be something that like becomes important to talk about as you progress and as you have people on your kind of management team that like kind of are worrying about risk, and so it like should be up there as something to talk about risk. And yeah, like geographically that also comes up quite a lot for us, like when we look at insurances generally, not just about data insurances, but I guess we've got like lots of other different types of insurances, employers liability, all of those kind of things. There's definitely some countries that you want your coverage to be higher than others, and you know, it really depends on where you're, you know, I'd say in this setting is like, you know, are you sending data outside of the jurisdiction that you're saving it in? You know, those kinds of things, those kinds of questions come up. So
yeah, and that must be a huge consideration for you, Emily, because you're handling employees' payment data, and that's seriously sensitive stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
How do you go about managing that risk? Like, what do you look to do?
So from the very beginning, I guess, you know, I hadn't managed that kind of data before when I came into this role, and one of the kind of boundaries, I guess, that I set myself was that we only take in data that we need in order to employ and pay people. We don't take anything else, like anything supplementary. Anybody's asked me about different pieces of data from elsewhere in the company, I say no. It's like we put like a huge amount of effort into, I guess, building an engine that allowed us to add countries on the fly, right? So like, you know, each country that we add to our platform is different and it requires different data. And that's the key piece of technology that we're working on constantly, is like making sure that we're only asking for the data that we need for that country. So say, for example, like, you know, we might set up in Portugal and they want to know like what qualifications the employee has. It would be very easy for me to build a platform that like says, right, everybody just gets asked what qualification that employee has now, but that's not how we do it. We just ask for it in Portugal, and we make sure that we minimize the amount of data that we're collecting. Another thing that I did quite early on, and like this has evolved over time, this isn't how we do it now, but like in the early days, whenever it came to highly sensitive data, for example, if we were doing identity verification or we needed to save people's bank details or anything like that, I'd always try and put that out to a third party that was expert at that, instead of sort of storing it in my own systems. Now that brings up another issue in terms of like you've now added a sub-processor. But to me, you know, as one person trying to kind of manage these decisions that I was making, that felt like a good boundary to set, that like, you know, we were always kind of almost like trying not to put it through our systems at all. We would kind of try to send it straight through the third party and then have a good relationship with them and figure out whether they were the right people. So we were vetting them quite heavily. That makes sense.
Yeah. And yeah, it's an interesting point about like your background wasn't in that beforehand and you had to like learn it from scratch. And Miguel, you
fear is a good motivator when it comes to these things as
well. Miguel, what were your experiences of learning all of this? Because you've been at Seedcamp for quite a few years now, but you started as the sort of tech lead, moved to head of technology. Yeah. How did you learn this from scratch?
Fear again is a very high motivator, and I think like I've been lucky to be at Seedcamp for, like you said, a long time, and we grew like a lot. Like I think we had 120, 140 companies when I joined. We're up 460 plus now, so growing substantially. The team size also grew quite a bit. We're now about 20-ish, and the problems started to be different. And I think maybe if there's one tip that I can share, and like a kind of a story, is like the default settings you might set up for, let's say like Google Docs or discoverability things, even internally. This is not things you share externally, but like discoverability settings you might set up that work really well for a small team of 4, 5, 6, 10. As you start growing, is like, should really everyone get access to that? And so I went through an interesting journey of essentially starting to be the gatekeeper and saying no to a lot of people. And a funny anecdote, yesterday a colleague of mine came to me and was like, you know, Miguel, I understand you more and more. And it was like simple things of like not giving access to everyone, because now she's in charge of part of a data and she's responsible for that, and understanding me being very careful about who you share data with internally. Do they need it? Do they, and you know, almost in the same way that you capture only the data you need, you know, and Emily, and I think that makes total sense, right? For us, you know, kind of from the nerd angle and the legal angle makes total sense. Like minimum requirements, it's like also minimum requirement permissions or access permissions to whoever needs that data, not who wants it. And I kind of always make that question when someone asks me to access things. Is like, do you want it or do you need it? Is like, I want many things, but like, do you need it? It's a very different word. It sounds the same, it's not. So that was an interesting evolution. And also in terms of, as the team size, the types of problems changed, and like I could manage a few laptops, that was fine. Now we're starting to get many, so you need to have different approaches on how you manage hardware and how you implement updates, and just simple things like that that you don't think about, but you know, you get scared and you see all these news about things happening to you know, other companies, like, oh shit, don't want that to happen to us. So and then you start becoming very much more active. So it's been a very interesting learning curve, even though I'm definitely not a cybersecurity expert. You have to learn the hard way, because it's a small team where it's me and Carlos bouncing ideas at each other. Like Carlos is one of the managing partners at Seedcamp, very tech savvy as well. And it's essentially us two just exploring things and bouncing it. I think another tip is have two people. I think having two people within your company that you can share ideas with in terms of security ideas, and, you know, should we do this? And because having someone to bounce ideas at, I found it very, very impactful. That's just my other last set.
Yeah. And it's an interesting point about kind of seeing data breaches in the news and going, wow, we need to mitigate it against that. Is that a big part of, like, Herman, when you're talking to the startups that you work with, do they ever come to you and go, we've just seen this in the news, how do we deal with it? Do you have to sort of explain the risks around certain things, and like how relevant, like, you know, let's say the BBC data breach was to startups?
Oh, that's an interesting question. What I would say is that the vast majority of the startups that work with Vanta, they come to us with a clear vision on what they want to achieve in terms of their security and compliance journey. Are they really concerned about data breach? I would say not that much, but it's probably the nature of a startup, because you need to take risk, you need to understand them. So probably the narrative is they see a lot of value once they start using Vanta, and they see a lot of value in the risk management module that we have, because that allows them to get a visibility on what is relevant to me as a company in terms of risk, and what should I prioritize on in terms of investing in security, in terms of implementing security controls. I think that's a super powerful exercise, and I've seen that there are two questions in the Q&A section that really covers two topics that are really boils down on risk management and how you want to really understand what is it going to impact your company and how you deal with it. And well,
let's jump into one of those questions.
Let's do it.
From Adrian, and Adrian says, we're very worried about malicious competitors or other actors starting APT, which is an advanced persistent threat, on us. What would be the right approach against it, Herman?
I think that every organization today need to ask this question. Because the days of there's going to be an opportunistic threat happening to everyone, which is the automated component. But once you deploy a web application online, it is going to be immediately visible on Shodan, and which is a open source library where you can find every connected device in the world. And malicious attackers will use that information to launch specific threats. Now, from there to go into your startup will be targeted by an APT, I think it's very unlikely at an early stage. It may get more likely as you grow and you start to get visibility and you start to get users and numbers. But at the beginning, I would not be concerned about APT, but I'd be more concerned about opportunistic threats that are of an automated nature. And then how you deal with that is really risk management as a starting point. And then you need to learn how to do threat intelligence. There's a basic part on how you do it, and there are very advanced things.
Yeah. Emily, how do you do threat intelligence? What does that look like for a startup?
I just think with all of these things, it's looking at it from a really small perspective in the beginning, right? Like I think it's really easy to go, okay, well, I need to do like the full job and all of these things, and then you just won't build your startup, right? Like because that will be your job. So you know, just more generally, I think that like, you know, there's another question in the feed there as well about like, you know, data governance policies and when do you start to do that? And I just think that like with all of these things, you just need to start early, but you don't need to have the full thing done, right? So like data governance policy, you know, like our early data governance policies was that like there's a Slack channel for this kind of chat and only these 5 people are allowed in it. And that means that every time something comes up that you need to you know, something comes up where somebody else needs access to that data, somebody has to answer that question. Somebody has to think about it and go, should this person have access or not, instead of it being like default that, you know, that person gets access. And I think that that's where you kind of just start to grow the culture, right? Like you start to grow a culture of like thinking about these things from very early days. But like you'll fail if you want to do it perfect from the beginning. And I think that that's kind of the hard thing to deal with, kind of almost emotionally, right? Like that you want to be perfectionist about it, but you can't, right? Because you have so many other things to do. So yeah, I think just starting early and starting small and getting simple things in place is really important.
Yeah, and I mean that really follows on from Miguel's point, doesn't it, about kind of these like default permissions on certain articles. And at what point, Miguel, did you become more interested in making sure that only certain people had the right permissions? And what I'm trying to get a sense of really is like, at what point does a startup or a company with a certain amount of people need to start really thinking about that?
I was trying to figure out like pinpoint an exact time, but I think you know, answering like the broader question, I think if there's something I would change looking back is I would do it earlier and start like just move it back to a bit earlier than we did. Not that we did it late, and I think we did it at the right time. But if you ingrain it, you know, more into the culture early on, it becomes easier, and then it also then floats to everything. Like, and that's like from the way, not only from the technical people, but then for the user interface people that are designing things, and for the product people that are designing features, is like, is security in there? And I think that I would just move things I would have started a bit earlier. So I think maybe on that front, if I'd be a startup, I would just start early. Don't think you have to do it right, and because in essentially you always have some level of policy, you just might not have it written down or have thought about it, you know, which is a bad idea. So writing down, even if it is a simple version, it's much better, because it means that a few people or a person allocated some thought into it, and you have it written down, and then it floats down onto all the bits of the company. I think, like, for example, looking at from a product angle, I think one thing that, for example, drives me crazy is like companies that add security as a paid tier, as if it was like something that you need to pay extra for. I'm like, really? Like, nowadays, really, you still think that 2FA is something you should pay extra to get access to? I mean, and I start cursing on my mind, and then I'm, you know, you need to deal with the real world, because and you don't tweet hate because it's a bad thing, but if you want to, but I think, you know, building those policies early on and kind of having that security lead is not the person's job, but it's everyone in the company. It should be everywhere, everything. Everybody should just not always think about it, but have it there as you're building your product, and you're building your teams, and you're building the way you reach out to customers, and building the way you store information, building the way you share information. Should just be always there, and have the buy-in from everyone early on is very important.
And that's a really good point, is this idea of getting cultural buy-in. Because for, you know, the CTOs or whoever's responsible in a startup for cybersecurity, it's really obvious why you need to be so hot on it. But for a marketer or someone in product or whatever, you know, it isn't their day-to-day job, it's probably easier to kind of take a more laissez-faire attitude. So how do you get buy-in from the team? Do you have a big presentation? Do you like present the facts? Do you do it more sort of covertly? Emily, what have you done at Boundless?
So I think the founding team taking security seriously is probably the first thing, right? Because they're the first people that are working on this kind of thing. So it's not necessarily, I think sometimes security people think of like really highly technical things, whereas security isn't about tech, right? Security is about, you know, just being aware and having processes that protect you, etc. And there are tech parts to it as well, but it's not just tech, right? So you know, all parts of the founding team, even the non-technical people, being like very vocal about it. I think like small measures from the very beginning means that it just like develops in your culture. So like my co-founder and CEO was, you know, very aware of that kind of thing, and like from the very beginning was, you know, like publicly in Slack channels saying, I'll never ask anybody to make bank transfers via email. You know, this is how we'll do it. So like, again, we didn't have anything written down, but it was there. And then one of the things that I think is super important is, you know, that open and public, but also that there's never any shaming or belittling if there's mistakes made. If something happens, somebody comes to you with something that's happened, that needs to be, there shouldn't be any kind of coverage of it. It should be like wide out in the open. Everybody should know about it. Everybody should know what's happened, and that like how we're going to go about like fixing it or addressing it or whatever, because you really want to foster a culture where people come to you with their problems, because if there's any consequence for coming to you with your problems, then they're not going to come to you, right? Like, so I think that that's probably one of the most important things that I feel it needs to be kind of like obvious from the beginning for the people in your company.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess mistakes can be fixed usually if they're caught.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And like you kind of, the bigger mistakes I feel are going to happen when you're later in your journey, right? So like if you're kind of building that expertise as your company grows, then that's really important, because it really comes down to cultural and team and people. It's not about software and technology, it's about people. So if you're kind of getting that in there early and you're like practicing when like something small happens, then you know what's gonna happen, when you know how to deal with it when something big happens, if something big happens.
I have one interesting story I might share if that makes sense. So we had a colleague that joined a while back, and after like maybe 2 weeks or something, like literally comes to me like with a face of as someone that has seen death, and I deleted the 1,700 rows or something, and I'm like, wow, clearly I was not, you know, like, yay. I was like, oh crap, but good, please, thank you, let's go. And we fixed it, and it was great. And I really, I learned a few things on that day. One, I really appreciated the fact that that person felt comfortable enough within our culture to, even though it was a new joiner, come to me and be like, hey, look, this happened, clearly not ideal, can we fix it? Or like, how bad is this? So that was very, very good. Also changed the policy, so now people only have read writes on that for the first month until they get used to the interface. You know, like month can be shortened, but that also changed part of the policy. And I do make it very clear every time on board a new team member that's like, look, we're small team, super friendly. If something bad happens, do not hide it, don't print that it didn't happen, come to us, we'll fix it. What we don't want to do is not know it or discover it like a year later. And that's just I thought of sharing this story because it perfectly matches, you know, what you were saying. And I have one example that came to mind, and it was amazing because the person came to me, we fixed it, and we changed policies after. So it's literally matches that.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, and like Herman, I mean, I would imagine people who join Vanta tend, because you're a cybersecurity platform, tend to be reasonably au fait with cybersecurity as a concept. But what about the startups that you work with? Do they come to you and do they sort of ask advice around getting cultural buy-in? Is that part of it?
Yeah, there are various components here. The usual profile of say a founder that comes to us, they either are quite technical and have had an experience with security before, so they know how to ask the right question, and then they leverage our platform to build that culture, because there is a component in Vanta that every user is then created an account where they do their training, their onboarding checklist. So as you said, Miguel, like there'll be some things that you're going to learn how to, for example, what's the template to onboard an engineer in your team? What's the template to onboard an operations person that has a security sort of angle to it? And then there are less technical, say more product-oriented people that have never, say, engaged with a security control before, maybe they've heard about it, and these let's call them personas, they would probably have the need to be guided. And that's where a platform like Vanta is super useful, because they are guided through the process from what you need to do to essentially meet your 27001 or SOC 2 compliance, which is something that your client are asking for. But then they realize in the end that it's not just the certification that you got, it's really the processes, the procedure, the mindset of security is important to us as a company. That really helps the product mature and scale as you grow. Because I think, Miguel, you probably can confirm that at some stage of your growth, security is going to become a prerequisite to be a VC investable firm. So if you have very weak security, I can probably, I'm not going to assign, but I can assume that it's going to be hard for you to get a Series A funding.
It's definitely an important part, an important component. I think, like, even so, there's a startup angle, right? As you become bigger, and then you need it. You might need it earlier, depending on the industry again you're on,
yeah.
and you know how strongly regulated it is. But that's definitely important. And even as a fund, like, it's as we grow as a fund, security like requirements for us as a fund are definitely leveling up, from regulations, from the LPs that give us money, from us internally, our own. We just want to be careful. So yeah, it's as you grow, it's 100% becomes it goes from, you know, on the scale of I want to have this for I must have this, it goes in that direction quite quickly.
Yeah. And in terms of this kind of like this growth, let's go back to the beginning and talk about like what well, I guess first, who is the person who handles cybersecurity at a really early stage startup? You know, who takes up that mantle? Go on, Emily.
CTO. I think it has to be CTO, but it's always it comes back to what I was saying earlier about like security being a people thing. I think that the assumption in the beginning is the CTO's responsibility, and the CTO does usually take control of it, but like it ends up being quite a COO thing as well. And that's something that we've kind of struggled through a little bit as well. Is like, you know, I can do so much, but then actually just bringing everybody together and making sure that like the systems for training are kind of happening on, you know, a regular basis, or whatever the cadences are, and just making sure that things are running and executing. I think it kind of moves from CTO over to maybe an operations person as time goes on. That's been my experience. I also took on a consultant quite early in Boundless's journey. We've a CISO who works with us on kind of fractional basis. And really, I think what's important to, I guess, for me to share is that like I didn't have expertise in this area when I was coming into it. I hadn't looked after this for a company before I was founder of Boundless. So really recognizing where your weaknesses are and where the gaps are, I think is important. So, I had to learn that, but I also recognize that there were other people that are better than me at that, and finding those people to support me, I think, is important. So, like that's how it's worked for us, I guess. The CTO to COO or operations kind of journey, I think is how it works.
Yeah, and I think that's it's a really interesting one, finding out about like then who takes up the responsibility after that first employee picking up that mantle. And
it's like it's an execution piece, isn't it? It's like, okay, you have to do the thinking around it, then it actually just needs to get done. And sometimes the CTO isn't the best person to do that, right?
Miguel, as a CTO, what do you think?
I think it's definitely that balance, right? And even like if you look at the things we've shared now, there's one part of it is bits and bytes, and the other part of it is process. And that makes of CTO, COO, and that combination of that power team to actually sync on that and make sure that the processes are aligned with the ways you keep the technical information, and you structure it and you store it, and you make it float around between the systems you need to. I think that makes 100%. I fully embrace that description from Emily. Makes total sense, that approach.
And how do you?
I guess.
Sorry,
just one thing on that. Most startups, I guess, have a CTO. Not all startups have a COO, so that's probably an important thing to kind of differentiate. So I suppose in my experience, it's been CTO over to operations because that was the shape of our startup in the beginning. Sorry to interrupt you. Okay.
No, that makes total sense. And Herman, do startups that you work with tend to go down the route of staying in-house, or do they, like Emily's done, hire a consultant who can bring in external advice?
There's no fixed playbook, I would say. We've seen all types of scenarios. So there are companies that have a CTO that has a strong security background, and in that sense, they prefer to maybe invest in other components. So they bring maybe a CISO or security manager at a later stage. Or there are companies that they need that advice, so they either rely on an external consultant, or they maybe take in a security tool that puts them into the right path. And I think that's to go back to the question on who does security at an early stage startup is, I think everyone involved in the product should think of security as a sort of at least a responsibility. So whatever you're doing, you need to consider, am I doing something that can bankrupt the company? Because imagine this scenario: you've just built your product, you just got your seed round, you have $1 million in the bank, you've hired people, you have everything's fine, and then you've done something terrible in terms of how you authenticate your users or how you expose your database, and all your enterprise client, they just go, sorry, we can't work with you anymore because you've lost our data. And that is end game for the company. So I know I don't want to sound like dramatic here, but it's a serious thing to consider. And it has to be really considered from the get-go.
Yeah, this is it. And I think it's like, we've just talked about the people involved in cybersecurity, but then how do you go about budgeting for cybersecurity, especially when you're an early stage startup? You've got so little funds. There are like other things at top of mind. Emily, how did you go about budgeting for this in the early days?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Like, I'm not sure that I was very purposeful about it. I think that CISO that I took on quite early, that was purposeful, right? So it was like 1 day a week or 1 day a month. And the idea being at that time was that we would go for ISO really quickly, right? Like we were going to crack the gate, get ISO really quickly. So we all had all our processes in place.
And what's ISO, Emily?
Sorry, ISO 27001. It's basically an accreditation to say that you're compliant and secure. Herman will know all about that to be able to describe it in more detail. But essentially, like when you get down the road, sometimes you might lose a customer if you're not accredited, right? So we were saying we were going to do that out the gate, but our budget of 1 day a month for a consultant didn't really get us to there, right? Like that, it wasn't enough resources. And for us to have done that, like in the very first year, I think I would have had to put like a lot of my time into it. So really that actually slipped. So like, I think, being honest, right? Like that slipped in terms of priority for us. And instead, what we discovered was that like having that consultant work with us, and he's still involved with the company, right? He was able to help us just kind of implement those early things where we're saying it doesn't need to be perfect, but you just need to have something. Like him being there from the beginning meant that the culture was there, if that makes sense. So like a consultant rate of 1 day a month was possible for us, I guess, and that was achievable. And then everything else really came down to me probably just trying to think about it from all angles, but not doing everything, but like thinking about it as much as possible from all angles. Sorry, I just want to go a little bit deeper into the ISO part. So we were looking to do it, but actually the value was that we were putting in some of those processes, and there's a couple of processes and things that you can get in place that just are so valuable in the beginning. And he helped us do that. And so the first is your business impact assessment. And I think that's one of the most valuable things that we have in terms of when it comes to like assessing what softwares we have across the company, assessing accesses, getting a cadence of like checking those accesses, checking those softwares, making sure you're not exposing yourself in too many places, making sure you're not adding sub-processors at a volume that's too high, right? It just means that you have visibility. And so like that was the first thing. And the second is an incident management plan. So really, really lightweight, like 5 bullet points. You open a Slack channel, this person is in charge of communication, like whatever it might be for your company, but like so lightweight, but it means when something happens, nobody messes it up, right? Because you've got five bullet points telling you what's going to happen next and who's in charge of making a decision. And so those kinds of things, it wasn't about the accreditation, it was about the fact that we started to think about the accreditation and just did those small things that like then were super valuable to us later when we were trying to do it in like a more kind of comprehensive way.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, having that structure at an incredible time.
Yeah.
Miguel, what did you budget for when you were kind of setting up cybersecurity?
It's super interesting because in the super early days, I think even simple things are frequently not disregarded, but postponed maybe. And like one thing we had super early on was like a good, reliable password manager. And I think like the fact that I've heard so many companies that don't have one and don't use one, and like that drives me insane. It's just, so that's something where we spent money pretty early on. We leveled up quite a lot since then in terms of how far, the breadth, the depth of usage, and making things secure. But just having those basic things, I think like just starting with the simple things, like it's very easy to, when you think about cybersecurity, going into like the crazy edge cases that you're thinking of, but sometimes the base layers are skipped. And so in the early days, definitely allocate money to such a simple thing as a password manager. There are a few good ones. Look around, find one that fits your needs and that you feel comfortable with, and just pay up for that. Like literally simple things like that. Is one where we spend money early on, and we have zero regrets of doing it since then, and got the team to get used to using it early on, the earliest on you can, like everyone across the team. Like the earlier you can do that, the better.
And how often should startups reassess the tools that they're using? Like, should cybersecurity leaders like put time in the diary, like once a year or twice a year, to like reassess the tools they use? Herman, what do you think?
That's an interesting one. Before I answer this question, I think that all the people that we have here today will probably like to hear what are the 10 things that you should buy that are relevant and cheap, right? I think first, make sure that everyone has a multi-factor authentication enabled. No SMS multi-factor authentication, really the authenticator app. Second, you need to have hardware encryption in place. And again, those two are free, right? You don't need to buy them. Then you need to have a good antivirus. That's another one that has a web proxy in place. So there is some sort of web filtering. This is important because one thing that people have to realize is that when you go to a website, there are a lot of redirection links that even if you think you're going into a legitimate website, there are redirection links that are dangerous. Then you need to invest in some cloud configuration. So make sure that you understand how it's your environment is well configured. Then you need to have a load balancer in place for your organization. Look at encryption for your web-facing platform, and then encryption on your database. And well, listen, I don't want to bother you with additional ones, but I think incident management is super important. And then get a spam filter and efficient filter in place. And I think those are really basic and important things to have. Now, going back to your question to when should you assess your tools? It doesn't matter in terms of, it's not a yearly thing. It's more on, you're in a space today where we have 5 users. Then when you get 300, or maybe you do something different, that's where you need to reassess the situation. Because in a year, in a startup, things can not change and don't need to change anything. But if in 3 months you went from 0 to hero, then man or lady, you have to like sit down and analyze that immediately because your environment has changed.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you think startups get it? Do you think there's enough awareness around around all of this?
Yes and no. That's my honest answer. I think yes, to a certain level. There are things that, as Emily said, in terms of your incident response plan, everyone goes, oh, we'll figure it out. Like, no, I have managed serious incidents, and if you don't know what you have to do, it's going to be super complicated. And sometimes even when you have prepared and rehearsed and you have all the tools in the world, there are some times that you don't see things, you don't have zero visibility. And that's going to be an interesting afternoon or a couple of weeks sometimes.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. And then, let's go back to Emily's point on getting ISO accredited, and with the idea that down the line certain customers will only work with you if you're ISO accredited. Is it how do you go about communicating cybersecurity measures to your customers? Presumably, Emily, that's a really important part of taking on new business, is making sure that people are aware that you're secure.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's often part of a procurement process for the customers. And again, the ISO part of things, it gives you that ability to check the box. But really, they tend to ask a lot more questions than just checking the box, right? You're being asked about all of these things that we're talking about today. And in doing the process of ISO, it's about the actual processes, right? In doing the process of ISO, then you're able to kind of communicate on those. So I think that there's some documents that you just kind of naturally end up having as a result of being asked for them through your journey. Your DPA, which is I guess more on the data side of things, but they're inextricably linked, right? So your DPA, and there's usually a technical measures or some kind of disaster recovery plan that just says, in detail how it is that you're managing people's data. And then business continuity plans usually come up as well. And again, having spent 4 years kind of growing our company. Like these things just like they grow as you grow, right? Like they can be quite lightweight in the beginning and then become more detailed as you grow and as you get more things in place. But yeah, usually people want to see documents like that somewhere along the way.
Yeah. Miguel, do you have to communicate cybersecurity plans externally?
We definitely go through a lot of questions on cybersecurity and how we manage, keep data when we're fundraising, which is something I think founders frequently forget, is that VCs tend to fundraise, and that in that part where we're essentially speaking with all the potential investors, we go through different levels. There are some investors that will go deeper onto that. How do you store data? Where do you keep all that? And they will go pretty deep actually. But yes, so we don't, even though we don't announce it publicly like on our website or anything like that, we definitely need to have that ready for at least in those situations. I mean, it's not only for that, but that's just one example about when that information is needed. Yeah,
it makes sense. And Herman, you mentioned that you've sort of been at the vanguard when shit's really hit the fan. What should startups communicate when things don't go to plan?
Okay, let's put it into the context of GDPR and your data processing agreement. So if you're a startup and you have a SaaS solution, you probably are processing personal data as part of your client processes, right? There may be variations of that. Now, in that context, if something happens within your environment that has an impact on your client personal data or the data they process with your software, you have to let them know in time so that they can let the data processing authority know within 72 hours of the breach being made aware of within the organization. Now, your data processing agreement may say something that is slightly different, so that, for example, you have to let them know within 24 hours or 48 hours. So they have enough time to communicate to the DPC as data controller. Now, within that context, first you need to have a process in place to, how do I communicate to my client that there is a breach occurring within my organization while I deal with the breach? And you have to do it in due time and in an effective way, because you need to give them the information. Now, that is a very complex situation to be in. And if you don't know what you're doing, then you're going to end up in a serious scenario. So I think that's where certification like 27001 or SOC 2 will really help you build those processes and that communication plan with your employees, with your clients, your employees as well. But it's important even to communicate that externally to your client as part of your procurement process. And one word of advice for everyone: if you currently have a technology product, have a section on your platform, on your publicly facing website, that says security or trust center, and write down what you're doing, because that is already a good way for your clients to evaluate you even before engaging with you. Because sometimes if I don't see any security section, that might create some additional questions. So always advertise if you have security, let people know.
Yeah, makes sense. Are there legal ramifications to getting that wrong, as well as just losing business?
There's definitely fines, right? Fines from the data data authorities for sure. Yeah, so it's different depending on jurisdiction, but yeah,
you can certainly get fined. You can certainly get sued by your clients, and you can certainly get in trouble with your investors as well, because they have invested money in your business, and now they'll be facing challenges as well. consult a lawyer as well in that concept, it's a good idea too.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. One last question before we go and wrap this up. How much is there a fixed cost to getting ISO accredited, or does it just vary startup by startup?
All right.
I think Herman, you're probably best placed to answer that. I could only like
Okay.
my experience. So
yeah, I would say that I've worked in companies that were providing certification. I was working with BSI, was one of the major certification provider, and the cost of a 27,001 certification, only the certification, is sort of well defined. You can get quotes depending on the size of your business. And then I think the main cost is the effort that you need to implement that system. So that's where Vanta as a solution really provides that value in automating that process so that you can then get the implementation at a fraction of a cost that you would go if you hire a consultant to do it. And then the certification process is faster because it's vastly automated. But yeah, to say it varies depending on the size of your business.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. I'm going to dip into the audience questions one more time. And Laura Cox has a question about resources in terms of learning about cybersecurity. And Miguel, did you tap into any online resources, or did you tap into other people in the industry? How did you build up your bank of knowledge around the subject?
Good question. Because it's been so, yeah, I'm trying to find actually well-grounded answer, like the real answer versus, you know, that one that sounds good. So I looked into a lot of things. So speaking to our founders, actually. So we have Seedcamp has companies that are in cybersecurity. So spoke with some of them. Quite useful resource right there. Very easy to speak to. And I read a lot of random articles. That is, I literally spent hours reading things. It's really hard to pinpoint, and that's actually giving me an idea for something internal for us to build, like a list of pointers to articles that would be useful for founders at early stages. I think that would be something very interesting for us to build up. That I might have V0.1 that I can polish and then share internally with our founders. But there was a lot of reading and speaking to other people and watching YouTube videos. Like everyone learns from YouTube as well. Let's not pretend.
Yeah, makes sense. Emily, what about your experience?
Yeah, not dissimilar. Like I definitely just consumed a lot, and I think speaking to people in your network that either have been through it before or who are experts in that area. And again, you know, my way of dealing with that and my experience of dealing with that was by having somebody by my side once a month or a day a month that could answer those questions for me. So like their expertise was there, but wasn't me kind of trying to figure it out from resources. I could just ask them the question that I had rather than having to kind of like go and find it. So I found that way of approaching things worked really well for me because it kind of cut down the time to figuring out the answers to specific questions as you moved through it. But yeah, I read a lot of stuff and I talked to a lot of people.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, look, that's about all we've got time for. So thanks a lot to all of you for coming along and getting involved. And thanks to our wonderful panelists, and thanks to our partner, Vanta.